Okay, this is feedback for Adam's paper 4 on CM Punk's pipe bomb. And I really like how this paper and this research project has evolved over the course of the semester. I think it's a really kind of fascinating look into a world and a culture that I'm really not super aware of. And I think that there's a lot of avenue for you to continue to do work in this area because I think it's a really interesting intersection of, um, I think it's an intersection between theater and sport, and that we do a lot of work on um, rhetoric and theater and rhetoric and performance, and we do a lot of not as much, but there's stuff out there right on rhetoric and sport. Um, but not a lot on the juxtaposition between the two. So I think that you could really do some cool work in this kind of area of professional wrestling. Um, that said, let's go through and start talking about your paper. As you walk through the paper, you walk through and you start with this McCarrowian theory, McCarrow-esque, McCarrowian look in terms of the rhetoric of domination and the rhetoric of liberation. Now, herein lies kind of the problem and the tension that I've got and the issue that I've got whenever I'm dealing with McCarrow. And I've talked about this, I think, to all three of you at some point or another in the class, is this idea of, what exactly is McCarrow talking about when he's talking about the rhetoric of liberation, the rhetoric of domination? Clearly, right, okay, I've got a text, okay, let's say CM Punk's speech. Is CM Punk speaking liberatory, right, liberating in his speech, or dominating? I think that's a fairly easy question, and I think that's an interesting kind of approach. Now, from a McCarrow perspective, as he relies quite heavily on kind of a Foucaultian sort of sense of power and the construction of power and the construction of ideology, in all likelihood, there's always going to be that interplay, right, where excuse me, where power is liberatory in one sense, but then constructs new or different, or further entrenches or hides other areas of domination. I think that's going to be the case in all of those papers when you rely upon McCarrow. McCarrow is, in the final analysis, though, not a method; it's a perspective. It's something that he even says that, right? It's not a methodology; it's a point of view. There's no thing to it. So what you're looking for in this speech is more of a kind of deep textual kind of criticism in which you're not going to apply a method, you're just going to go into the text, right, and start pulling from the text and the context and the situation and doing so with that kind of perspective of McCarrow in mind. The paper is good. The things that I want you to concentrate on as you move into paper 4, or excuse me, as we move from paper 4 to the final paper, have very little to do with what's going on in your head and everything to do with how that translates onto paper. And this is something that I think that all of the students in the class, that all of you could benefit from as we look at your final papers. And that's the idea of kind of a clear, systematic sort of organization. Like your paper should have a nice, clear, logical flow to it so that from beginning to end I know what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you're going, what's going to come next, and how all of the pieces of that analysis sort of fit together. So while this is directed specifically at Adam, I think that all of you in the class could learn from it, borrow from it, and take something useful and valuable from it. So how would I have wanted to see Adam's paper set up a little bit differently? I'm going to pivot the microphone and the camera here a second. Get a nice panoramic shot of my office there. Let's zoom in here on the computer though. All right. Okay, let's start with the idea of an introduction. Okay, now, one thing I want to make clear is that I've given you these very, very short papers with very, very short kind of turnaround times, and I get it. Now, as you move into the final paper, though, this introduction needs to like gel, coalesce, be solid. Okay, your introduction always should set us up for the topic, right, and make us intrigued and interested. You need to remember that your readers and subsequently and also your reviewers, the people who will be considering whether or not to publish you or admit you to the conference, right, they're going to make a lot of decisions about you in the first minute or two of reading your paper. So you need those kind of attention-getting kind of things in the introduction, and you've got one in this paper, right? Professional wrestling and its significance in American culture. Okay, this is something where you're going to talk about, right, like how many people watch professional wrestling, how much money it makes, how big an industry it is, and also how many people are paying attention to it, and also its uniqueness. Like, not a bad idea to mention here the idea that it's this unique intersection of both sport and theater. Um, you're going to also then talk about a little bit about CM Punk's pipe bomb speech, right? And how that speech, was an important aspect of that professional wrestling world. How many people talked about it, how many people showed up on, all of those kind of statistics and stuff. And then the last thing is that sort of statement of significance. Like, as a rhetorical scholar, as a rhetorician, why are we interested in? And I think that what you want to suggest here is that this provides this kind of unique kind of look at, control and resistance, about domination and liberation, and how and the intersection of the two in the context of this, seemingly unintellectual, anti-intellectual kind of culture. Your introduction should be fairly short, but it should be succinct and it should be important. It should give us a preview. At the end of your introduction, I should know that you're doing a paper about CM Punk, that you're doing an essentially critical theory perspective, that you'll be drawing on the works of McCarrow, and that we'll be looking at this intersection between domination and control, or resistance and liberation, right? Okay. Now, what do we want to do next? All right, in almost every case, where we want to go next is we want to go to theory, right? So your theory section, and in most rhetorical criticisms anymore, the theory section is going to be relatively short. But here's where you're going to lay out McCarrow, right? You're going to lay out McCarrow's theory and McCarrow's perspective and what it is that you're going to do. This is descriptive. Now, for my class, you probably want to just rely exclusively on McCarrow's work, but if you're talking about for a final paper, and definitely when you start thinking about publication, and definitely when you start thinking about submitting to conferences, you're going to want to beef this up. You're going to need to go beyond McCarrow. McCarrow's theory, right, published in 1989. There's been a lot of work about him since then. There was a special topics of one of the journals dedicated to his work, so a lot of back and forth where he defended his theory and other people suggested changes to it. So you're going to want to look at kind of more of those things. But where I particularly like to see you beef this up is to look at Foucault, and in particular his discourse on language. And it's like on the second page of the discourse on language, right, is where he talks about how in every society there's got to be a vehicle for or mechanisms for controlling and constraining the power of discourse. It's just too powerful to let it just be, right? So it's got to be controlled. And he lays out some of these principles, right? Like who can talk, where they can talk, when they can talk, what can be talked about, the modes of discourse, etc. And this is where you bring in, I think, this really unique idea that what your paper looks at is this different mechanism, one that doesn't exist in a lot of other environments, at least not on the surface, right? But this idea of not who can speak, but the persona or the character within which one is allowed to be a speaker, right? That they must present in the form of this character as a unique and really unexamined mechanism of social, political, economic, discursive control. Because that's, I think, really what the paper is about, for me. And let me back up here a second and put the microphone camera back down. The issue that comes through in Adam's paper, in your paper, Adam, which I think is really super important and really interesting, right, is this notion of control. And this is where, I think McCarrow synthesizes Foucault, but where you could benefit, I think, quite a bit from going and looking at Foucault in the original. The discourse on language is not a hard read. It's really available. It's really easy to find. And it's one of the more accessible works that Foucault does. But Foucault talks about these ideas of control. So, for example, I'll use a completely different example to kind of get this out. When we're talking about economics and economic policy in the United States, right, and whether or not their economy is in recession, or whether or not we're having growth, or whether or not okay, there's certain people who are allowed to speak on that issue. In order to speak with any level of authority, you need to be an economist, right? An economist, financial advisors, financial planners, these are the folks who are allowed to come out and speak. There's also a where we're allowed to speak kind of thing. There's these, select forums in which the discourse is allowed to take place. It's really allowed to take place on, for example, the news. You're allowed to come on CNN, you're allowed to speak, and your voice has authority. A guy standing on a street corner, who's had his house foreclosed on, is not allowed to speak with authority. That's not considered an authoritative kind of discourse. He doesn't ground the discourse at all. The discourse doesn't coalesce. He doesn't shape and influence that discourse. Or, for example, on issues of health, doctors are allowed to speak. There's also a certain language with which those doctors are allowed to speak. They're allowed to talk about it, but notice that there's doctor speak, right? One of the people that you read when we were talking about style, Richard Lanham, and I'm not sure if this is in any of the excerpts that you had or not, but on style, one of the things that Lanham talks about is he talks about how he had recently gotten hip surgery. He'd had his hip joint had to be replaced. And one of the things that he talked about in that was this notion of language. And he actually includes the doctor's language, all of the technical terms for the bones and the joints and the procedures that were done. And then he says, the guy could have just said, the socket and ball weren't working together. You needed a new ball. He's like, I understand ball and socket. That's a fairly simple mechanism that I get. I don't understand any of these other terms. But on the other hand, and Lanham points this out, if the doctor had said, you need a new ball and socket, your ball isn't working, he would have been a lot less likely, first of all, to pay the exorbitant fees to fix it, right? Because it's so simple, why would I pay that much money? But also, he'd be very questioning about the integrity of his doctor, who spoke in terms of like balls and sockets, rather than, tibias and fibias and, cartilage and all those other words that I don't really know. You see my point there, okay, right? That it's not just who can speak, the doctor, but the language that the doctor is allowed to speak. Also times and places and occasions. Now, clearly, this is also true of the world of professional wrestling, right? Vince McMahon and his kind of cohorts, they control the discourse. And part of the way they control that is by who can speak, when they can speak, what can be said, the language of what's being spoken, etc. But another mechanism of control here is the personae from which one is allowed to speak. So, I have a wrestler, let's call him, Awesome Adam, right? Awesome Adam, the wrestler, has been wrestling, and he occasionally gets to have that microphone kind of moment. Now, for Foucault would say, this is an incredibly powerful moment, because what we've done is we've given, our workers, so to speak, we've given the proletarians of the professional wrestling world, the laborers upon whom the entire industry depends, and the control of whom allows the reproduction of the means of production of this particular kind of money-making, capital-creating enterprise. We've given them the microphone here for a minute. That's an incredibly powerful kind of moment. It's a powerful kind of statement. So, and in so doing, there has to be then control. That control often comes with who can speak, when they can speak, what can be spoken of, and all of these kinds of things. But also the personae from which in the character. Awesome Adam has been asked to leave the world of professional wrestling. He has now future endeavors, right? Okay, the future endeavoring of Adam, Awesome Adam. But even at that moment, Awesome Adam has to recognize that he must speak as Awesome Adam and not as Adam Key, individual person who may feel very wronged by these events, and that keeping you inside that personae is part of the world of the mechanism for control. It's one Foucault doesn't really talk about, and it's one that hasn't really been developed in any other kinds of areas, in part because it's unique to professional wrestling. Now, see, that is the kind of key. That's the hook. That's what makes this, I think, a unique study and makes it different from just, hey, this guy CM Punk did a big FU to the professional wrestling on his way out the door, and it made him more popular than ever kind of a thing. Okay, let's go back. I'm going to move the microphone again so don't get seasick. Not just the microphone, but the entire camera, right? Okay. Now, what you're doing here is you're just kind of previewing what's going to happen. The next stage of our paper here is the body, right? Okay, the main analysis. Okay, now, what you've got to do is, this is where you do a lot of this stuff on the world of wrestling and on CM Punk and who CM Punk is, right? This is where you start. I want a history of wrestling. I want not 30 pages of history of wrestling, but where the sport began, when the sport started, how the sport's evolved, and ultimately the story of wrestling that you're going to tell is the story of how Vince McMahon ultimately ends up in control of the organization, right? Your second thing that you're going to do is you're going to talk about who CM Punk is, CM Punk's role in the organization, and then about the significance in the moment of his speech, right? And what this speech actually did, okay? And in this. And the reason the speech is significant is because it breaks all these rules. This is also when you're going to start talking about the mechanisms of control. Now, the one thing that I want you to do, Adam, and the one thing that I want all of you to do, even if you're doing something not on professional wrestling, is this focus, right? Okay, what I'm getting from a lot of you as you go through is this sort of kind of meandering, wandering sort of stream of consciousness narrative where you're like leading me through the process of how you like thinking about it. What I want here are clearly delineated lines of control. And the most important thing that you can do, I think, in this sense, is label them, right? Label them, okay? That, I think, is the crucial kind of move. Okay, I want you, and I'm looking for kind of preview statements, okay? Management's control over workers is essential in order for both Vince McMahon to control professional wrestling, to make sure that there are no other organizations, but to solidify that kind of dominance over the event. Okay, in order to exert that control, he uses, 3 primary mechanisms, 1, 2, 3, and then elaborate. Here's one, and explain it. Here's the second label, and then explain it. Here's the third label, and then explain it. This gives us that kind of clear structure that the essay is missing. Okay, I mean, you've got all these ideas. There's not one thing in this paper that I would change in terms of its ideas, but there's a lot that I would change in terms of structure, right? Okay, that said then, our next aspect of it here is we're going to look at CM Punk's speech as, a revealing of them, exposing these methods of control, right? Exposing this aspect of personae, right? And then importantly, the speech is about, and what your paper is really about, is that he reveals these things and makes visible the mechanisms of control by challenging those mechanisms of control. And again, in the same way that up here you're going to clearly delineate, the lines of control, and you're going to give them label, here you're going to clearly delineate his lines of resistance. And what I'm looking for you here to do is I'm looking for you to name them. Name those lines of control. That, I think, is just crucial and specific. Give these lines of resistance names so that we can say, he did this, right? He did that. And one of them, actually, coincidentally enough, is, I think, naming, right? And I think that's one of the most kind of like really cool, insightful things that you have in your analysis, is the way that he uses names to break that third wall and expose and create then this new level of real, right? The next thing, though, that I think is really interesting, and this is the number 5 on the screen here, that I didn't show you, is this idea of how, the response to the way that we try, right, remember, like, discourse breaks free, all right? But when it breaks free, the immediate response of a freed discourse is the arrival of a way to try to constrain it and put it back inside the box, right? Okay, how do I get it back under control? And the way that that was largely done was first bringing CM Punk back inside the organization, right? Now CM Punk is back to being CM Punk instead of being, I forget his name, but the person, right? So he's back under the control of the organization. The second thing, though, is to raise questions about whether or not the discourse was real. right? I mean, that was the way that we attempted to control it. The control of the discourse was to say, oh, that wasn't real discourse freed and broken from the third wall. That was just a really, really, really amazing performance that looked like it had broken through the third wall, created this sense of reality in the sport that heightened the level of audience participation and awareness, right? So that's the kind of backlash response and the mechanism of control, because that's the idea. What you get is liberation, and liberation is always going to come into conflict with, resistance and domination. Okay, so you've got the control exercised by McMahon and his organization. Okay, CM Punk fights back against that by breaking the persona, by breaking the third wall, by stepping out of character, this massive mechanism of control. And the response then, the resistance from the organization, is to try and name and re-identify his activity by saying, nope, that wasn't the real person in a real discourse. That was still part of our overall performance. See, because he's still a character inside our organization. And that's, I think, how the flow of this discourse works. And that's the kind of explanation that you want to get from that. And that's really how this kind of Macaroian kind of criticism works when applied to something like this. So you've got a great paper and you've got great ideas. What I'm looking for is that clear, delineated structure of them. And I think that regardless of what you do in terms of your final paper, and I know we've talked about going back a lot to the American Dream and the myth of criticism, I think that to keep kind of these Macaroian ideas in check and in hold is a really kind of not a bad idea. So bring them with you if you can, but if you want to do a more straight kind of mythic criticism, I totally get it. But the clear thing is going to be clearly delineated main points, and within those clearly delineated subpoints, with previews, reviews, labels, names, so your paper has a nice, clear, followable academic-y structure. It's been a great paper, and it's been a pleasure reading all of the work that you guys have done, so good job.